This is really a walk down memory lane because The Taker is an old story for me. It actually started with a short story that I wrote when I was in my 20s that was based off of a trip I had taken when I was a teenager with my parents to a very remote area of Maine. And just that creepy isolation had always stayed with me. So I wrote the story, never published it. Right around that time, I went to work for NSA. They didn't want you writing on the outside. So I kind of put my writing career aside for about 15 years. When I came back, because I got very sick, developed a neurological condition. And in order to take my mind off of not knowing what my future looked like, I went back to writing. And it was like deciding you're going to run a marathon after just sitting on the couch eating potato chips for 15 years. I was horrible. Well, there were a lot of iterations, but in that early story, the early story was really a ghost story. And it bears very little resemblance to the books that ended up coming, except the Lanny character was there in spirit. She didn't appear, but Jonathan was in that story, and he comes in at the end of the story. But it was a very different kind of story. So it took me 10 years to get The Taker from when I decided to come back and writing at 40 until I sold it at 50. 10 years to go through all the changes necessary to write a story that was saleable, because that was sort of my goal. I mean, I would really be surprised if I was going to get published. That should not be your goal when you're first starting to write. It should be to be able to write a complete novel, one that works and stands on its own. But I did want to see if I could write a book that could be published. But it was such a wild and crazy story, and a difficult story, because from the writer's perspective, it has a lot of very challenging aspects to it about time and place and point of view and everything, right? It's a very ambitious story. And so for a beginner to write it, it took me a lot of time and a lot of trial and error. I mean, it always had the present day frame, because at the heart of it is this 200-year-old romance, and romance in a bad way. It's like a romance you should give up, but this woman just cannot give up on this man that she's fallen in love with from childhood. And this romance haunts her. She tries to control it. She finally gives in, but she ends up having to take his life because and I think we're going to talk about what the supernatural element is, because it's not a standard, supernatural trope or anything. But because she sort of controls his immortality and he wants nothing more than to be released, she ends up having to kill him and let him go. But that's not the end of her story, because she's made a very powerful enemy along the way, and he just pursues her. The interesting thing is Jonathan, the love object, doesn't change. So he's not, he's a main character, but he can't be like the main character. And the one who changes is the diabolical man who's pursuing her. He's the one who's changed by love. It was really interesting, because that's not how I envisioned it. And it's a prime example of how characters really will drive your story. They have to be what they are. They can't be anything else. And so the story formed around them. They're very powerful characters. To this day, I get fan mail from readers who just can't stop thinking about them.